There we go. So now we're recording. So we're going to go ahead and get started right now. First thing first, as we go through this, if you see some of these, or if I say some of these terms, this is what I mean. So TOA is term of attendance, season of competition, we might say SOC. PSAY is a big one we'll talk about a little bit today, and that is post-secondary amateur year. If any of you guys sat in on the Fall Coaches webinar, some of this will be familiar, but we have tailored it more to women's wrestling. So beginning this year in the 2019-2020 season, you guys are invitational year 2. So what does that mean? That means that all of our NAIA eligibility rules now apply. So you guys were in year 1 last year, so that was your year to kind of get prepared to become a full invitational year 2 sport. And so now that you're year 2, all of our rules apply, including having eligibility center determinations for first-time participants, certifying all of your students as eligible through ECP, which we'll get into in a little bit, and also students will be charged for previous seasons of competition. In addition to this, there are numerous rules that you need to meet up with your FAR, your registrar, your AD to make sure that they're meeting everything. But just so we're clear, the only exception that invitational sports get is the exception to have to go through the eligibility center. They have no other exceptions to any of our other bylaws or eligibility requirements. But if you have a student, and we sent this out about a month ago, if you have a student that meets these 4 criteria right in front of you, they do not have to go through the eligibility center. For all students that do not meet these 4 criteria, they do have to get an eligibility center determination before they can compete for you. Excuse me. So the first one, this is all looking at invitational year 1. So the first one is the student was certified under the eligibility rules of the sports governing body in the sport's first year as a recognized invitational sport. So that means last year, for all your students that competed for you, they must have been eligible to meet this criteria. So they had to have been actually eligible under whatever eligibility rules you guys are competing under during invitational year 1. The second thing is they must have actually represented your NAIA institution in a contest in invitational year 1. It didn't have to be a varsity contest, but as you can see in criteria number 3, you guys have to have sponsored women's wrestling as a varsity sport on your declaration of intent in invitational year 1. And then number 4 is looking towards this year. So just because they meet these 3 and they don't need to go through the eligibility center, you still need to ensure, and this is through your compliance person, AD, FAR, and registrar, that they meet all of our eligibility requirements. So just to do a little bit of story time here, last year bowling, we communicated this same sort of stuff to bowling, and we got a lot of calls midway through the season where there was a kid that maybe was in his 20th term of attendance or had already competed for 5 years, thus not meeting any of our term of attendance bylaw or our seasons of competition bylaw, and they were ineligible. And the argument that the bowling coaches made was, well, they were exempt because they met the grandfathering clause. The grandfathering clause is only for the requirement of having to get an eligibility center determination. If you have any questions on who needs a determination or if a student meets grandfathering, please reach out to Maggie or myself, and we'd be happy to walk you through that because it's such an easy thing, and I don't want to have any forfeits or anybody lose any seasons of competition because of something as simple as this. So now when kids go through the eligibility center, I just wanted to kind of point out, and we do not work in the eligibility center. We work in conjunction with them, but we are far from eligibility center experts. But I did want to point out that what the eligibility center does and does not do. So it sounds like we have a question here. Maggie, what's the question?
If an athlete competed unattached as a red shirt but was eligible, do they have to go through the EC?
So that's a good question. If they, in year 1, if they competed as unattached, that means they did not represent your institution in competition. That student most likely would have to go through and get an eligibility center determination. Yep.
And then it says, how about a kid that transferred from another NAIA institution? The sport was varsity. She competed NAIA?
That's a good one. Email us that one after we get off. We do have an NEC interp on that, and I'm not up to date on it at this exact moment. So email us that one, legislative@naia.org. I'll give that out at the end as well. And then once we come to a decision on that, I'll have Nathan email everybody so that you guys know the decision on that one. Okay. So getting back to the Eligibility Center, thank you for those questions, by the way, and as we go, we'll try to address those as time permits. So feel free to throw them up in there. We'll probably continue to cruise along, and then we'll answer some of those at the end. Okay, so the Eligibility Center, this is what they review and what they do not review. So they're obviously going to check to see what how many terms of attendance a student has used, seasons of competition, academic eligibility, and when they graduated high school. What they're not going to review, though, is amateurism, transfer releases, suspension residency, and eligibility certification. So amateurism, they're going to flag it. If they see that a kid potentially was a professional wrestler, they're still going to say that that student is eligible if they are, or ineligible, but there will be a flag on their Eligibility Center determination saying that you guys need to do more work on your end about checking for amateurism. Amateurism is the responsibility of the school to double check. Legislative Services is here to help you guys, but it's ultimately your guys' job to make sure that students meet the amateurism bylaws. The second part is transfer releases. So if you had a student that transferred from another four-year institution, the Eligibility Center is not going to double check to see if the kid meets the residency requirements. You guys are going to have to double check that on your end through a tracer and through communication with that previous school. Suspension residency, the same thing. We're here to help, but we've got a lot of briefs on suspensions and dismissals, but ultimately it is the school's responsibility. Again, Legislative Services is certainly here to help. And eligibility certification. So one thing that we always try to impart on new sports and new coaches as they come in is that getting an Eligibility Center determination is not the end for that student. The student still has to be certified on campus and included in the ECP software, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But just because they have an Eligibility Center determination doesn't mean that the road is ended for that student. They still have to be, there's another step that you guys have to handle on campus. So getting into some new legislation, this is stuff that was passed at the 2019 convention. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I've written I've written briefs on all of this. It's all available on the legislative homepage at naia.org. But basically what the membership did was brought a lot of stuff that was happening under the table up above to where it's all a lot of things that were happening that were technically illegal and bylaw violations is now allowed per our bylaws. So the first one that I'm going to talk about here, and I got ahead of myself, I was talking about financial aid, is the class rank exception. So this doesn't go into effect until the 2020-2021 academic year. But I think it's good for you guys to understand as you guys are going out and recruiting right now. Basically, if a student does not have a class rank on their official transcript, they can meet the bylaw exception that you see here in red by having 9 institutional credit hours passed prior to identification at any institution of higher learning with a grade of C or better. And you guys have to accept it on your guys' official transcript before the student, in a term before the student wishes to compete. So that could be in the summer, or it could even be in the spring, technically, if you wanted to use it that way. But these are classes. This arose out of our initial eligibility task force. It gives students that don't have the ability to meet 2 of the 3 because they don't have a class rank to meet it by proving that they've earned 9 institutional credit hours. So they basically AP classes or dual credit classes. And if you guys accept those and they have C or better in all 9 of those hours, then they can meet the exception for class rank. Again, I wrote a brief on this. I'm going to go pretty quick on these, so I would go and check out those briefs, again, on naia.org and then the Legislative Services homepage. The other one, this one is in effect for this year, mid-year eligibility. Basically, if a kid only meets one of the 3 initial eligibility requirements, it used to be that they had to wait essentially 2 full terms to get outside of those initial eligibility requirements. Now, if they meet one, they can meet the mid-year eligibility opportunity by enrolling and identifying at your NAI institution and passing 12 institutional credit hours with a grade of C or better during their first term of attendance. So this has to be earned at your institution. It has to be C or better in all 3 of those classes, so there's no GPA requirement, and they all have to be institutional credit. Again, wrote a brief on this, and as you can see down here at the bottom, there's 2 steps that the student must meet. All right, so here's financial assistance. This is what I was talking about a minute ago when I was talking about things that were happening under the table that were technically violations of our bylaws. The membership created this long bylaw change, but it's definitely for the betterment of the student body and for the betterment of our athletic association, because this separates us, one, from the NCAA, because it lays out exactly what you guys can and can't do for your specific students in regards to financial aid and financial benefits. One of the things, and this is why we have it written in red here, we've gotten a lot of questions this summer, and it's been nice to be able to utilize what you see in red to tell schools that stuff is allowed. So if it's allowed and open to any student on campus, then student athletes can also take advantage of that. So let's say that your school wanted to bus kids to a game and pay for their fees or their admission prices to go to that game. It used to be that the student athletes couldn't participate in that, even if the general student body could. Now, because it's available to all students, it's available to student athletes. Athletically related expenses, this is a ton of writing, as you can see, but we wanted to put the full bylaw in there. So basically, technically, before this bylaw change, it was per our bylaws, it was not allowed to do anything, to provide the students with anything. So headgear, singlets, wrestling shoes, any of that sort of stuff was technically a bylaw violation. Now, we say anything that's incidental to intercollegiate competition can be provided by the institution. Again, this is just bringing what was already happening on campus to light and making it allowable. Part 3, this is a big one, and if anybody was at the National Convention, it got pretty interesting. But before this bylaw change, again, if they received financial assistance from anybody outside of their immediate family, which at the time we didn't define, that would have been a bylaw violation. So technically, if a student wanted to or was going to receive money from a grandparent or a godparent, something like that, to help them with school, it would not have been allowed. It would have been a potential financial aid violation. Now that is allowed. We define what an immediate family is. The membership included host families as well. And then the one part of this bylaw talks about things that are not incidental to or not related to their athletic participation. So if somebody wanted to take out their girlfriend who was an NAIA athlete and provide them with Christmas gifts and take them to dinner and pay for their meal, before, technically a bylaw violation. Now, things that are not related to their athletic participation or their standing as a student athlete, that is allowed. This is one that might impact you guys a little bit. This is something that was changed, came from the Bowling Coaches Association, but they increased the amount that students can earn and basically win in competition and not violate their amateurism standing. So if they're identified with an NAIA institution at the time of the competition, then this bylaw and the amateur award, recognized award bylaw will be in play. If they're not identified with an NAIA institution, so that could be in the summertime, it's whatever the sports governing body rule is on award, on what awards would violate a student's amateurism. Again, I wrote a brief on this. Amateurism is its own beast. We don't talk about it very much today, but I'd be happy to help everybody if they have any questions about that in particular. All right, get into seasons of competition. This is the definition of seasons of competition is in Article 5, Section B, Item 18. Students get 4 seasons of competition per sport, and they're charged 1 season of competition for any participation in an exhibition or intercollegiate contest. So this means that if they are even on the mat for 1 second, they're going to be charged a season of competition if they're representing you guys in competition or it's an elite level competition. So we have this question all the time. Well, I only played for 5 minutes. I'm going to lose an entire season of competition. Yes, 1 pitch, 1 play, 1 second. It's going to start a season of competition. So intercollegiate competition is basically varsity or non-varsity. You guys call it JV or freshman or developmental. It doesn't matter. So the kids are going to be charged if they participate in varsity or if they participate in non-varsity. Transfer students, their seasons of competition, we're going to take what the previous association charged them at face value. I don't think that'll be a major issue with women's wrestling, but you never know. So if the NCAA for some reason charged a student 2 seasons of competition in women's wrestling, we would take that at face value and would not do any sort of competitive experience review for that student. Now, non-collegiate competition. So this is participation in leagues or experiences. So for you guys, it would be meets, so those open meets. They can be charged for those open meets if it meets the evaluative criteria of basically what is elite level criteria. More than likely, when they wrestle in these open meets, they're more than likely going to be chargeable. I would err on the side that the student is going to start a season of competition by competing in these open meets. Now, there is something, and we talked about this a minute ago, PSAY, we're going to talk about it in the next slide, but no season of competition will be charged during the 12-month grace period after the high school graduation date. So we're going to talk about the 2 other exceptions. So prep school exception, an individual who trains or competes as a member of a non-collegiate post-secondary education team will not be charged a season of competition. So questions with this one that we get a lot is what qualifies as a prep school. That's actually found in CFAR policy. It can't just be one of these places that are kind of run out of somebody's backyard. It needs to be an accredited prep school. And if the student competes in the prep school, then they would not be charged a season of competition. The second exception is the PSAY. So if you remember, the PSAY stands for post-secondary amateur year, amateur being the key word there. So if they participated as a professional wrestler within that kind of PSAY, they wouldn't get the exception of the PSAY because it would not be amateur, it would be professional. But PSAY is basically 12 months from the date of high school graduation or the 18th birthday if the graduation date cannot be ascertained or the student earned a high school equivalency such as the GED or HiSET. So seasons of competition, tricky, and the best thing to do is to always err on the side of caution that elite level competition is going to start a season of competition. If you guys have any questions about this, we have tons of briefs. We've got tons of education materials out there about season of competition, but I want you guys to kind of get a little taste of it here so that you know what questions to ask. So, what's another exception to elite level to seasons of competition? The unattached criteria. So this unattached criteria that you see in front of you was passed at the 2018 convention. This is what's in effect for you guys right now. There are these 5 criteria. We're going to go through each one of them. But basically, if a student meets all 5 of these criteria, then they will not be charged for that competition. And there is no limit on how many times a student can compete unattached and not be charged. That could be coming. We hear about it every year as a potential bylaw proposal, but we haven't seen it yet. So the very first criteria to meet the unattached, and they have to meet all 5 of these, okay? Just going to reiterate that over and over again. First one is the coach or representative of the athletic department does not enter the student nor pay for the student's entry fee for the event. It doesn't matter if a student pays the coach back. The mere fact that they paid for the entry fee will mean that they don't meet this criteria. So the coach or representative of the athletic department cannot enter the student or pay their entry fee. So the student, if they want to compete unattached, they have to enter themselves and pay for that entry fee. Number 2, the student cannot represent you guys in any way, and that includes wearing an institutional uniform or using your guys' name in the event. I know we had some questions about this whenever we had the Women's Wrestling Coaches Association meeting this summer about headgear. Headgear does count as part of the uniform, so if it has your school's logo on the headgear, technically they would not meet number 2. Number 3, all competition and participation must conform to NAIA amateur status regulations. Pretty self-explanatory. Number 4, students are academically and athletically eligible for intercollegiate competition in accordance with all of our rules, conference rules, and your institution's eligibility rules. This includes they have to be certified and certified as eligible on or through the ECP software. So they have to be treated just like any of your other students, and they have to be eligible and certified as such to meet number 4. And then number 5, an identified member of the coaching staff does not provide coaching, evaluation, and or feedback to the students on site and or for the duration of the event. So does this mean that you have to shield your eyes and you can't watch or take any notes or anything while a student's competing? No. It just means, and this part of the bylaw criteria came directly from issues that we were having with wrestling coaches. Kids were wrestling unattached, but there were 4 wrestling coaches in their corner, coaching them, helping them, providing them with strategies and feedback, and the membership felt like that was a little bit too much. That's why they created this 5th criteria. So I saw a question there. Yes, if a kid meets the unattached criteria and wrestles all season long, they can wrestle in as many events as they want. As long as they meet all 5 of these, they will not be charged a season of competition. Like I said, that's the way it is right now. That could change in the future, though. So back to number 5, the duration of the event. So if you have a multi-day event and you have a kid that wrestles on day 1, and then isn't going to wrestle on day 2, can the coach provide feedback or evaluation on day 2, even though the kid's not wrestling? No. It's for the entire duration of the event. You got to wait until you get back to campus and outside of that event to provide that feedback. A couple of things you'll notice here. There's no limit on if the kid can travel with you guys. There's no limit on if the kid can stay at the same hotel with you guys or if you guys pay for it, and there's nothing that says that you guys can't feed these students. All of that comes down to safety and well-being of our student athletes. So all of that, you can do that. They can travel with you, you can feed them, you can put them up in the hotel, you just can't provide any coaching, feedback, or evaluation. All right, recruitment. This is found in Article 2, Section C and Section D. This is pretty straightforward. Our recruiting rules, thankfully, are pretty simple, but we'll break them down nonetheless. So, high school students, you guys can pretty much do whatever you want. We don't recognize letters of intent. Your conferences might, so you might want to check with them, but we don't recognize letters of intent. So when a kid's still in high school, they're technically still considered a free agent, or in our world, a prospective student athlete, which means that you guys can contact them at will. There's no limit on how many times you can tweet them or message them or anything like that. You guys can do whatever you want, basically, with high school students. Junior college kids, contact is allowed with a junior college student at the conclusion of the academic year in which a student participates in their first season of competition. So if a student goes to a junior college and redshirts for their whole freshman year, you cannot contact them after that freshman year. If they competed, and then once they get outside that freshman year, then you can contact them. So it's all about when their first season of competition is used, then you can contact them after that. Now, do I think that one's followed all the time by everybody? No, but this is a good time to remind you guys that per our bylaws, if you're aware of another institution violating our bylaws, it is a requirement that you guys report that to the national office and to that school that's committing that bylaw infraction. Graduate school students, contact is allowed the day after the student graduates or completes all requirements of the undergraduate degree, whichever is later. Always use myself as an example here. I graduated in December, but I needed to take one more class in the spring to actually get my diploma. You would not have been able to recruit me until I finished that class in the spring. Now, if an athlete contacts you, you can communicate with them once notification is provided in writing from the AD, FAR to the institutions, to the student's current institution's AD and FAR within 10 days of that contact. So a kid calls you, says, I want to come and wrestle at your institution. You say, where do you go to school now? They say another NAI institution or another 4-year institution. You technically need to tell them, okay, well, I'm going to have to provide them with notification. I can't talk to you right now about transferring, but I'm going to provide notification. Once you provide that notification, you and that student can communicate freely. One thing I will point out about this rule, and it's a little bit of a nuance, that makes it a little bit more difficult. There's nothing in the notification piece that says that those students have to be student athletes at that other institution. So if they're identified at a big state school and they're in a sorority and they contact you about transferring and coming to your school to wrestle, technically you need to provide notification to that school. Now, are you ever going to get in trouble for that? No. If, the big state school's AD is going to be like, I have no idea who this kid is. But to follow the letter of the law, if they're identified at any institution of higher learning, you have to provide notification before you continue with that communication. Notification needs to be provided in writing, so you can be via an email, and it needs to be sent to as many of the people at that other school as possible. So AD, FAR, head coach, all those people, just to make sure you cover your bases. This is the biggest thing that we see where schools get sideways with each other, is not providing notification. It's an easy thing to do, and once you do it, that communication with that student, you guys can do that freely. So tryouts, individual or group tryouts may be conducted, but they're limited to no more than 2 days for a specific student at a member institution. So we've clarified this a little bit in the bylaws. It's per student, per institution. So if a kid came and tried out with you guys when they were a freshman in high school for 1 day, that would be 1 day of tryout, and they would only be able to do it one more time for the rest of their life, basically. It used to be restricted only to your guys' campuses. That's been removed, so now you guys can hold tryouts anywhere. So what I used to do whenever I was a coach is when we were on the road, we would always bring in recruits when we were on the road. I wasn't at an NAIA school, so don't report me, but we would bring in recruits while we were on the road and work them out because we had access to different students that we normally wouldn't have. Now you guys can do that as well. So you can bring them in and they can work out with you guys while you're practicing on the road. All right, so a little bit more in depth here with the notification piece. Like I said, it must be within 10 days following the first contact, and you cannot respond to that student until that notification has taken place. The other big point is you guys cannot initiate contact with any enrolled student athlete. This is something that the NEC, or the CEC, Conduct and Ethics Committee, takes very seriously. Since I've been here about 2.5 years, I've seen several coaches be banned from the NAIA for life because they were actively recruiting students who were identified at other member institutions and even NCAA institutions. So this is something you guys got to be really careful about. Another thing where NAIA schools tend to get really sideways with each other is when coaches are trying to poach, is kind of the word, students from other schools. So you guys cannot contact anybody directly that's identified at a member institution or any institution of higher learning. They have to contact you first, and then you guys provide that notification, and then you can communicate freely. So I get this question from coaches every now and then, well, I know that, I'm interested in the kid, and I know that they want to transfer, but I can't contact them directly. What do I do? What I would recommend is you reach out to that coach and say, hey, I heard that this kid's not happy, or maybe this kid's not getting the playing time. Can you have them call me and kind of talk with them through that? Once that kid contacts you, you provide that notification, you guys are good to communicate from there on. Now, a release provided by a student does not negate the requirement for notification. So every now and then, we'll get a call a kid will have called you and said, I want to transfer to your guys' school to wrestle. You say, okay, you're doing everything right, but I need to provide notification. The kid says, well, I got my release, so you don't need to provide notification. That's not true. Release and notification are two different pieces. The release is talking about transfer release. So if they competed at that other four-year institution and want to transfer to you guys, they have to sit residency for 16 weeks unless they have a release from the previous school AD and a GPA of a 2.0. So a release and notification are two different pieces. There are exceptions, and we talked about this a second ago, but if a student has graduated and earned a baccalaureate degree, you can contact them at will, like we mentioned, and the same thing with kids that are at junior colleges once they complete that academic year where they use their first season of competition. All right, so we got a little case question here just to make sure everybody's following along. So JJ wants to transfer from his NAIA school and has let his current institution know. At his request, his current athletic director issues him a blanket release statement that would allow him to compete immediately. JJ contacts you, and when you notify her that you cannot speak to her without notifying her current institution, she supplies the release letter. Do you still have to contact her former institution? The answer to this is, like we just talked about, yes. This type of release could be used to meet the residency exception, but it does not negate your duty to contact his former institution. One thing that we talked about in the fall sports webinar, if you guys are on that, the implications of the transfer portal. I am not aware if women wrestling can be in the transfer portal, but I just think I'll just throw it out there for you guys. The transfer portal does not affect our transfer rules, our recruiting rules, release rules, or notification rules. It has no impact on our bylaws. All right, we got a couple questions here. Maggie, go ahead.
Are teammates allowed to coach non-attached wrestlers?
So the question is, are teammates allowed to coach unattached wrestlers? They would not be considered a identified member of the coaching staff unless they are serving as a GA or something like that. So technically they could probably provide encouragement and evaluation and feedback as long as they're not an identified member of the coaching staff.
And then what classifies as a tryout?
So a tryout is basically any time that you bring a prospective student on campus and for the sole purpose of evaluating their talent. I believe tryout is defined, I can't remember, but it is explained in that tryout bylaw. If you got more questions about that, we can look into that. Again, I've written briefs on the tryout piece, so feel free to type in tryout in our search bar on the NAIA website, and they should come up. Anything else? All right. So transfer and prospective students. A prospective student remains a prospective student until they meet the definition of identification. So identification is anytime a student is enrolled in 12 institutional credit hours that will show up on their official transcript from your institution, or if they represent an institution in an intercollegiate contest. I know it sounds like how could they do one and not do the other, but we have seen that before where a student competed and maybe they weren't enrolled in 12 institutional credit hours. So those are the two ways that they can be identified. Prospective students must identify first with an institution in order to practice and compete with an institution's team during the summer, so May 16th through July 31st. So by identifying, so they have to enroll for the fall semester or take a full course load in the summer. That's how they would identify in order to practice and compete with you guys during the summer. And they also must identify first before they practice and compete prior to the start of the institution's academic term or between regular academic terms. So let's say you had a kid that was going to transfer into you guys in the spring of 2020. You guys have a meet. Classes in, let's say, December 1st. You have a meet on December 20th. Can that student compete in that meet? Potentially, but at the very least, they're going to have to be identified for that spring term. We're not going to get into inner terms today because they're way too in-depth, and your ADs and FARs and registrars are the ones that need to be dealing with that. So prospective students, they cannot practice with you unless they're identified. So they're not identified until they actually are enrolled in 12 institutional credit hours. The story I always tell about this one is football coach a couple years ago called me. His starting quarterback had 2 terms of attendance left. He competed in the fall. He then went part-time in the spring at the same institution. The coach called me in the summer. He said, hey, I just want to make sure everything's okay. He's got his 1 term of attendance left. He went part-time in the spring. He didn't practice or do anything with us in the spring. And I kind of cut him off, and I said, well, that's really good. But since he was identified with your institution and he didn't identify anywhere else, he was no longer considered a prospective student. So even though in that scenario the student was under 12 institutional credit hours, because they had identified at that institution in the previous term, they were not considered a prospective student, and technically they could have practiced. Now, had he gone and identified someplace else and then gone part-time at that school, he would have still been considered a prospective student and would not have been able to practice. Kind of convoluted, but again, I promise you that it actually is pretty easy when you sit down and look at it. So some odds and ends here. I mentioned this earlier. So we have what's called, and I think a lot of you guys are men's and women's wrestling coaches, but I know that we do have some people that are brand new to the NAIA that have no idea what ECP is, hadn't heard of that before we started talking to them about it. So ECP stands for our Eligibility Certification Process. And so this is through NAIA Help. You guys do play a role in this. You guys shouldn't be the data entry people. That should be the FAR per our bylaws. Compliance can assist the FAR with that. But you guys do have to sign off on these eligibility certificates in order to complete the process and to have these kids be eligible. So ECP, this is this is a student's profile page here. As you can see, this is what it looks like right now. Obviously, name, campus student ID, that's whatever number you guys give them on campus. ECID number, so if they are going through the eligibility center, then they would need to have an ECID number in there. But this is why it's highlighted there, because you guys are the only sport that really should be utilizing this year. If they are grandfathered through, you would simply check that box. Again, you guys wouldn't be doing the data entry, but whoever is doing it would say the student does not have an ECID number. That would trigger us to know that the student is a grandfathering student. Then you just go through, and the data entry person should be able to enter all this information in, and then at the end, once you click save, it'll pop up at the bottom if the student is eligible or ineligible. Again, this is the first step in the ECP process. Where you guys come in is when the FAR is going to submit an eligibility certification process, or eligibility certificate. They will submit that certificate with all the students that they consider, that they believe to be eligible. We hope that they are eligible. That eligibility certificate then gets sent to 4 different people. It gets sent to the AD, the registrar, the FAR, and you as the head coach. This is your opportunity to go through and check and make sure that everything that's in there about all of these students is correct, and that these students are in fact eligible. That means there's 4 different people that are signing off on this, and so whenever we get these violations and we say, well, the student was ineligible, and you had 4 different people that should have caught this because it went through all these different steps, this is your opportunity to double check. Make sure, so we can all sleep good at night, that everybody that's listed as eligible is in fact eligible and all the information is correct. Once that eligibility certificate is signed off by all 4 of those people, it goes to the eligibility chair for your conference. It doesn't come to us. We can see them, but we do not monitor them. It's the eligibility chair that sees them and monitors them. We will occasionally check, just do a little check to make sure everything's going okay, and we always see them whenever FARs call and they have questions. But again, it doesn't come to us, so you can't say, well, we submitted it and you guys didn't let us know that somebody was ineligible. We can't do that on our end. We get about anywhere from 100,000 of these to 150,000 of them a year. We don't have the resources to go through and double check everything on all of them. But so that's why it's really important for you guys to take this seriously when you get those eligibility certificate emails. You'll get it via email. You need to click on it. It makes you review it before you can accept it. If everything looks correct, you simply hit accept. If something's wrong, you hit decline and let the people know, whoever your data entry people are, what the correction is that needs to be made. So this is something we don't normally talk about, but it's becoming a hotter topic in the NAIA right now, and I might even look to Nathan if we have any questions on declaration of intent to help us out with this. But declaration of intent, your school declares what sports they consider to be varsity that are going to compete in postseason, or varsity that aren't going to compete in the postseason, or club, or if you guys aren't even going to sponsor anybody. You have to do that. I think it's due by April 1st for the next year, and it has to be submitted. So one thing that we hear a lot is, and this happened with bowling last year, team had a ton of violations. They basically had done a lot of things wrong, incorrectly with their bowling team. They then said, well, we'll just undeclare, and then we'll be okay, and we'll get outside of those violations. No, that's not how it works. You can't just undeclare and say, well, we weren't a varsity team, but you were a varsity team at the time the infractions took place. So if you're sponsoring women's wrestling as a varsity sport on your campus, then you have to follow our NAIA rules. So I'm not going to go through and read all of this, but I do want to draw your attention to C3, so the third thing down there. Should an institution that declares an intent to participate in NAIA postseason undeclares after September 1st, so this is September 1st, I believe, for fall sports. If they undeclare after September 1st of the current academic year, the institution will be fined $2,500. Why this is important is because we take the amount of teams that declare varsity postseason participants in a certain sport, and that's how we develop our postseason criteria and who's going to get in and all of that sort of stuff. So by dropping out, it has more of a ripple effect than people might understand. So undeclaring, there is that fine of $2,500, so you might want to just make sure before you guys do undeclare something that it's really, truly what you guys want to do. Nathan, you got anything to add to that? All right. So, practice. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I got a phone call yesterday about one of our wrestling schools that was basically participating in practice with high school students. So first off, anytime your student athletes are competing in your sports, wrestling, with people that are not identified at your institution, it's going to count as a scrimmage, an exhibition, a game, something. It's going to count as a competition of some kind. We do not have joint practices. I cannot stress that enough. We do not have joint practices. That's not a thing in the NAIA. We hear this all the time, well, we just got together, it was more of a joint practice. Well, if there were people there that weren't identified with your institution, it's not a practice. That is a competition of some kind. Thus, every student has to be eligible, certified as such, and it counts against your frequency of play in some way or another. Joint practice is not a thing. Story time again, I had to tell a swimming coach last year, they wanted to do a charity swim across a lake and there was going to be another school there. Technically, they were participating in their sport by swimming, and there were going to be people there that were not identified with their institution. I had to tell that coach, you can do that, but it's going to count as a competition of some kind, and all the students have to be eligible to compete in that whatever competition that's going to be. So we do not have joint practices. However, that tryout piece, we got the question about what a tryout is. You can bring in people from outside of your institution, so high school kids, for instance, or a prospective student athlete, and they can work out with your team. They can wrestle. I know you guys kind of don't really have inter squads per se, but they could wrestle against your guys, against the women that are on your team, and they can do that twice. They can get 2 days of that and meet the tryout criteria, but anything more than that, and it's going to be a competition of some kind. So be really careful about that. We had a coach get banned for 5 years because he routinely brought in kids that were not identified with his institution to compete and to practice essentially with his school and with his identified student athletes, and he was banned for 5 years just because of the blatant disregard for the fact that we do not have joint practices. So just something to be aware of. Practices, what's defined as a practice? A practice is defined as an activity organized and or directed by an identified member of the coaching staff of that sport in which appropriate equipment is used or instruction and or evaluation of the athlete takes place. So Maggie, I probably drove Maggie crazy earlier this year because I broke this down into about 10 different paragraphs breaking down the practice definition. But an activity organized and or directed by an identified member of the coaching staff. So if you guys say, hey, we're going to open up the gym at this time, we're not going to be there, but you guys have to be there. You guys just organized and directed that to be a practice. So even though you guys might not meet the second part of that by being there to provide evaluation or instruction, you guys ordered them to be there. So if it's mandatory, it's a practice, right? So then if in which appropriate equipment is used or instruction and or evaluation of the athlete takes place. I get this one from basketball coaches all the time. What if we go to the gym, we don't even use the basketball, or we don't even use basketballs, and the basketball goals are up, and we're just walking through some of our plays and stuff. How is that a practice? Because evaluation and or instruction is taking place. So it's appropriate equipment or instruction and or evaluation of the athlete. Okay, just something to keep in mind. Conditioning and weight training does not qualify, so that would not trigger your 24-week season. You guys can obviously have the kids be conditioning and strength training. That does not qualify as a practice as long as you're not doing anything, any sort of evaluation or instructions taking place for the sport of wrestling. All right, medical hardships. I'm going to let Maggie talk about this one for a minute so I can get a drink of water.
Okay, so a hardship request would be if a student athlete got injured during a season of competition and they're wanting to get that season of competition back. So a couple of things to note for wrestling. The maximum amount of dates allowed to get a season back is 4 days of competition. So if they compete in 2 matches in 1 day, that's 1 out of the 4 days. And then for frequency of play, you're up to 20 days. So it's a certain percentage of your frequency of play for each sport. So for wrestling, it's 4. And for wrestling, scrimmages don't really come into play because scrimmages are not considered a thing in wrestling.
Right, yeah. Scrimmages is not a thing in wrestling. Yeah, and so a couple of big things that she mentioned here. We only can grant medical hardships for intercollegiate competition. So if they competed on their own in elite level competition and they get charged, they're competing in some outside open event, we cannot grant a medical hardship if it's not intercollegiate. 4 is the limit. These come directly to Meggie. And Meggie looks at these and we look at them black and white. So either they meet the requirements or they don't. That 4 dates that she mentioned, if they compete, they're in their 5th date and they wrestle for half a second, that still will count. And I can tell you the NEC, if you request an exception, is going to deny that as well. Couple other things. They cannot be hurt in the last regular season competition or in postseason competition. In any competition after being determined incapacitated shall nullify the hardship. So Maggie sees that all the time. So I'm going to show you guys the form here. And I'm going to let Maggie kind of pick it back up. But one thing I want to point out is that these students have to be seen by a doctor and determined incapacitated in the season in which they were injured. So they have to be seen during that sports season. So as you guys get close to the end of your sports season, you need to be looking around and say, okay, who here had a season-ending injury? Have they seen a doctor yet? If they haven't, you better get it done pretty quick. So Maggie, can you kind of walk us through this hardship request certificate?
Yeah, so the top sections 1 and 2 should be pretty self-explanatory. When you get to Section 3, that's where you're listing all competition. So you list the dates. If there are multiple competitions happening on one day, then obviously when I take a look at it, I'll just note that as one of the 4 dates. But you want to list all your opponents out there. And then, does women's wrestling do DAC stats, or how do they?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we look at this, we also check to confirm, like with your season schedule and all of that, that all the dates and competitions match up. So I just would reiterate to be really clear on those dates of competition listed there. Then Section 4, we need a signature from the AD or FAR and the coach. And then Section 5 is where we get the most errors. So just want to be very clear with Section 5. This is to be filled out by the physician, so either a medical doctor or DO that sees the athlete after they were injured. So this is to be filled out by the doctor, and each question, so 1 through 6, each of those require an initial by the doctor. So every single question has to be initialed, or else I'll have to send it back to you and say, can you please have the doctor initial each of these. In question 3, that is the date that the doctor sees the student athlete. So that's what Lindsay was referring to. That should be within the season of competition, and if they compete after that date, then this hardship request certificate will be nullified. So we can't grant a hardship if they compete after the doctor recommends no further competition. And then in question 4, that's the date which the athlete would be medically fit to return. So that has to fall outside of the season of competition, obviously, because this would be a season-ending injury. And then Section 6 is for us to fill out.
Yep. So a couple of things I want to expand on. So all you guys need to submit when you guys send in a medical hardship is the form and their transcript from the term in which they were injured, or from the season in which they were injured. So we want the transcript. It can be unofficial, but you have to send it in to us because we want to guarantee that the student was actually enrolled in 12 institutional credit hours, and all of that good stuff. So we need the official transcript. We do not need any of the medical documentation, which is why Section 5 is so important and why we require those initials from the doctor. Again, it can only a medical doctor or a doctor of osteopathic medicine with those specific licenses can actually sign off on this. So that means no athletic trainer, no nurse practitioner, no DPM, so no doctor of podiatry medicine. If they don't have an MD or DO behind their name, they cannot sign off on this. We'll always send those back. Number 4 down there in Section 5 is an estimation. So one thing that, and Maggie, I can't remember if you mentioned it or not, but they have to have at least a month and a year listed there. It can't be TBD. It can't be after Christmas. It can't be anything like that. We actually have to have a month and a year. We used to require a month, date, and year, but now we're loosening up, and it's a month and a year. We actually have to have that. And if that date is not outside their season of competition in which they got injured, we have to deny it on its face. So you can submit those directly to Legislative Services by sending it to legislative@naia.org. There's no time limit on when you can supply medical hardships, and the other big thing is that it only gives back a season of competition. It does not give back terms of attendance. All right? So I'm going to go to the resources page, and I see that we have some questions here. So a couple things that Legislative Services has available for you guys. We have the interpretation library, which is basically where the National Eligibility Committee has gone in and provided clarification on some of the more gray areas of our rules. Really interesting for a bylaw nerd like myself to go in there and read stuff. But if you guys have questions about the bylaws, you always want to double check the interp library to see if there's an interpretation out there. Those interps can be treated exactly like the bylaws. A link to that is on our legislative homepage. Second thing is the Learning Center. So something that we rolled out this summer to all institutions. So there's specific tracks. Hopefully you guys got the emails on this with the sign up. If you didn't, email legislative@naia.org. You guys should have gotten access to this. But basically it's courses and rules education courses that you guys can take at your own speed and at your own time frame to go through and just make sure that you guys are understanding everything that we're providing. Coaches campaign, this is kind of part of what we're doing right now. We do rule-specific or season-specific education with the coaches. We've created coaches pamphlets that your school should have and should have passed out to you guys. And also the coaches campaign arose out of the fact that we had literally thousands of forfeits. And those forfeits affect the students and affect the school, but it affects you almost more than anybody else. So being former coaches and student athletes ourselves, we understand that all of every forfeit is painful, and we also understand that all of them are avoidable. Every single forfeit and violation that we've had since I've been here, I haven't seen one where that was impossible to avoid. They're all avoidable, and so we're trying to provide you guys with more education so you guys can try to avoid those situations. So bylaws, sport rule, and policy definitions. I know we kind of hammer you guys on this, but we get so many questions about it, which is why we want to make it as clear as possible. So bylaws and legislation. So this is voted on by full membership and impacts full membership. So this is all the stuff that's found in our Constitution and or our bylaws. So if you guys wanted to change, let's say you wanted to change how many dates that you guys could compete in, that's in the bylaws. So even though it only impacts your sport, it's a bylaw amendment. That would not be a sport rule. So sport rule. So let's say you guys wanted to instead of wrestling on mats, you guys wanted to wrestle on trampolines. You guys, that would be a sport rule that you guys would have to bring up to your coaches association, and then it would have to be voted on by the National Administrative Council. And then policies. So a lot of our stuff that we have to follow is in policies. So policies are created by the different councils. So we have the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives, and the other big one is the Council of Presidents. So if there's stuff in those policies, the only way that the policy can change is through that specific council. So for instance, our financial aid exemption, so what student qualifies for exemptions through financial aid, that's COP policy. So if you don't like the way it looks, you need to talk to your president about potentially trying to change that within the COP. Another gentleman in the Champs Department and myself, we're going to do a video on this. So we're going to put it on all of your guys' coaches' corners. So if you have any questions about this, you can look there, and you can always email us. We answer them enough. We don't mind answering them anymore. So the one thing I will say about bylaw amendments is that they're due to us 90 days before the official convention or the annual convention. So this year, that's pretty much right after the holidays. So you almost want to get them in before the holidays. You have to have a sponsor and a co-sponsor. So a coaches association can sponsor legislation, but your co-sponsor cannot be another coaches association. The reason why the membership made that rule is because they were having the Men's Soccer Coaches Association and the Women's Soccer Coaches Association wanting to bring forth bylaw proposals that impacted soccer. Well, that just kind of jumbled everything up and made it more difficult, so the membership switched it. And so if you're a coaches association, you have to have your co-sponsor be a council or another association of another kind. It can't be another coaches association. But 90 days before, send them to us. We help vet those, and we can help you guys through that process. All right, so we got a couple questions here. So are we allowed to financially assist athletes that earn the right to attend developmental training camps or tours? So that's a good question. We would need to look into it a little bit further. The easy answer right now would be maybe, because there is a new caveat in the financial assistance bylaw that states conferences, schools, and or the NAIA can pay for students to travel, meals, room, and lodging to compete in an event that they basically earned the right to compete in because of their intercollegiate competition. So in that specific instance, we would need to we would need to look at that a little bit more closely whenever that situation arises. All right, so the second one, when did this practice bylaw take effect retroactively? I'm not quite sure which practice bylaw you're referring to, but the practice bylaw has been the same ever since I've been here. And I've been here, like I said, about 2.5 years. I can go back. I actually created an annotated handbook a couple years ago, so I can go back and see exactly when that practice bylaw came into effect. But whenever it did, it took effect moving forward, so it wasn't retroactive. It only impacted moving forward, but it hasn't changed this year. I just wanted to bring that to your guys' attention, the practice bylaw and the joint practices piece, so that you guys were aware, because we get a lot of questions on that, specifically from new coaches. All right, so if we wanted to have a discussion about not being charged a year of competition for competing at senior level events when not attending to use one, would that be through a policy? So that's a really good question. So seasons of competition specifically is in the bylaw, so that would be a bylaw proposal. So like I mentioned, you guys would need to get that in 90 days before, and then you would need to have a co-sponsor. Don't worry about having it all wrapped up and perfect, like it's going to go to the event or go to the membership for a vote. That's one thing that Legislative Services does, is that we go through and vet all of those, and then we work with you guys as the sponsor to try to clean that up as much as possible. Do we have a list of those tournaments that are approved to compete in during the season? Not sure. That would be a Nathan question, I believe, but I don't believe that, at least Legislative Services doesn't have that available. So I know we're about 5 minutes over. The person that asked that question, you might email us so we can check that out. So this is Legislative Services. This is our information here. Brenda White's our Associate Director. This is our hotline number down there, so call that number and one of us three will almost always be able to answer it. If we don't answer, leave a call back, because we clear all that stuff out every day. We'll do everything we can to get it back for you guys as soon as possible. Legislative@naia.org, that's where you can send your questions, as well as all of your medical hardships. So, Nathan's number is on the website. I don't have it directly in front of me right now. And but anyway, so it looks like Maggie's answering a couple more questions. I'm going to give us just 2 more minutes. I'm going to put you guys on mute and see if we have anything else come up. All right, guys, really appreciate your guys' attendance here. This was recorded. I know we went fast on some stuff, but we'll get with marketing and have it put up on your guys' Coach's Corner as soon as possible. Wait till next week probably before it'll get up there. But again, Legislative Services is here to help you guys. We want to be able to assist you in any way possible, so you guys have a clean, smooth transition into Invitational Year 2. If you guys got any questions, feel free to call us at that number or email us. Hope everybody has a lovely rest of the day, and good luck this season.